Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. This is sort of a semi-response to a really brilliant video by Technology Connections called You Are Being Misled About Renewable Energy Technology. This might seem a little bit strange. This is not the type of topic I typically talk about on my channel. I'm not usually a big technology guy, but this video isn't really about technology. Technology Connections, if you're not aware of who he is, it's a very big YouTuber. He's one of the few YouTubers I actually actively enjoy. And what he does is he takes old pieces of technology, like an old toaster or an old kettle or a light system or whatever, what have you. He'll give the history of how it came about. He'll disassemble it and show you how it works. And it's genuinely extremely educational. Now, in this latest video, You Are Being Misled About Renewable Energy Technology, he talks about exactly what the title indicates. He goes over the ways in which renewable technology is actually something perfectly attainable right now. We have the technology to do so. He also talks about how fossil fuels have essentially reached a dead end in terms of how efficient they can be made, and that there is actually no reason except for, frankly, naked political corruption for why we are not moving towards renewable energy. And he breaks down some misconceptions about its viability. For example, this notion that we don't have the space for solar farms, that electric vehicles can't travel very far, and so on and so forth. All that aside, he does something brilliant at the end. He runs to the credits, ends, and then he makes this massive statement. Massive. He moves from talking about the technology, moves from doing the thing that his channel does, to leveraging the attention he has gotten for that content to flat out say, guys, you're under a tyrannical government. There are ICE thugs being sent into cities to intimidate and murder American citizens. Laws are being run roughshod over. The checks and balances that make democracy possible are being completely flattened. You need, and this is the part that I loved so much, you need to start caring about each other.
We have to care for each other. Don't wait for someone to lend a helping hand. Be that helping hand. Organizing networks are popping up everywhere because those of us who manage to grow up into adults who care about people other than ourselves are not going to stand by and let this illegitimate government run by petulant toddlers violate the Constitution and the very principles that make America great.
And I think this is actually the most important, most powerfully leftist statement that someone can make. And I wanted to talk about that because it is the thing to do if you have any existing power under current conditions. This is how you leverage. This is how you leverage influence for good. This is how you do politics, genuinely. A lot of channels try to do political content. I'm guilty as charged here. I do political content. I talk about political theory. I talk about political philosophy. Occasionally I talk about current events. I've been moving a lot more into the philosophy territory lately because I've been finding it to be a lot more interesting and a lot more useful in terms of just increasing my understanding of things and building the connections I need in order to make interesting insights and tell them to you. But generally, when I see political content online, and I've been guilty of this in the past as well, what I see are people who are making their bread and butter exploiting controversial events, often involving real harms to real people, in order to get some clippable debate moments onto their channel. They'll go onto places like Modern Day Debate, they'll go on to Jubilee, and it'll be some kind of garbage where it's a liberal versus a conservative. They're both play acting that character, that stereotype, and they just get into a yelling match and nobody's minds are changed. And the purpose is essentially to use politics as a brand to lift yourself out of the gutter and get a solid passive income talking on your computer. It's not actually that political at all. It just kind of steals from politics in order to turn politics into drama. Now, a lot of people who do political content, quote unquote, as their thing, will defend what they do by sort of gesturing at a need to, debate the other side and to convince them to change their positions. I think this is massively mistaken, but I think the basis of the mistake, besides an obvious cynical desire to justify what one is doing in order to make money and get famous on the quick, is this idea that people's political alignments are based upon them being possessed by an ideology. And ideology is an interesting concept. I think it's a very bad concept these days, and I'm going to talk about why. But it's also very useful. It's very useful if you need a pat answer for why people behave the way they do, because fundamentally that is what the idea of ideology is meant to accomplish. It's meant to give you an explanation for why people behave consistently with people on their side. What makes a fascist, for example, consistently vote for politicians who want to limit their rights and limit the rights of women and so on and so forth? Well, a major part of that, someone who believes in ideology might argue, is that they have these sets of values. They have, if you will, a sort of character sheet of the different kinds of things that they care about. And so a politician can run off of, hey, I will satisfy X, Y, and Z. And so, of course, people who are ideologically aligned with that will then go along with it. We run into problems, though, when people stop being consistent with their avowed ideologies. For example, let's talk about one of the Americans that ICE agents murdered recently. Alex Pretty was an ICU nurse in Minnesota who was ganged up upon by 7 or so ICE agents, pepper sprayed, disarmed, and then shot 10 times while he was down. Cold-blooded murder. Now, right-wing defenders of the Trump administration and apologists for ICE have been attempting to argue that this killing was justified because Pretty had a firearm on his person. Now, there are 2 obvious problems with this. The first one is the most glaring, which is he was disarmed before he was shot. There was no justification for shooting him while he was on the ground, incapacitated. The second one is where we get into this weird territory where right-wingers are now suddenly using the bare fact that a civilian possessed a gun as a justification for executing him in the street. Which is strange, because American rightists usually make a really big deal about how they will never surrender their guns and how a government that wants to take its populace's firearms away is intrinsically tyrannical. So ideology, this thing which is invoked to explain the reliability of the behavior of fascists, doesn't actually seem to do that. It actually kind of seems to just post hoc describe avowals about their values that fascists have made in the past, but which in practice don't actually constrain them to this or that pattern of behavior. What actually accounts for the behavior of fascists then? Investments of desire. Specifically, since we're talking about a politically invested class of person, at least superficially, we're talking about investments of desire in institutional power. So the question then becomes, does institutional power right now get in the way of or facilitate the satisfaction of those desires? And we've seen this time and time again. When institutions get in the way of fascist desires, they're all big free speech advocates. They're all about rebellious nonconformity. They like to bill themselves as a counterculture. They're all about the neutrality of institutions towards forms of expression, and they're all about the right to bear arms, the right to assemble in public, and so on and so forth. But then, when institutional power facilitates their desires, suddenly all that goes out the window, and they're about revenge. And they will find any excuse whatsoever to justify it, or they won't. They'll just change positions and just run with it. And this is not because fascism as an ideological system is in some sense intrinsically hypocritical. Maybe it is. That doesn't matter. The reason is that, as an ideological system, it has no power. It has no life. It is literally just a sheet of paper. It's a character sheet. It's a set of characteristics of a thing that doesn't live and change or connect with anybody. The fascist as an ideologue is an abstract model of an actual person that doesn't have any lived connections based on desire. It's really important to understand as well that this goes for everybody. This isn't unique to fascists. This is the case for everyone. What makes fascists stand out, however, is that we're talking about people who have zero regulating tether between their society and the use of state power to assert dominance. And so, in the case of fascists, that arbitrariness and violence that is the result of being completely alienated from your society, from having no social regulation of your actions or behaviors or values, is able to be made much more loudly manifest. This is why in their book Anti-Oedipus, the philosophers Deleuze and Guattari refer to ideology as an execrable concept. The reason why fascism is a specifically capitalist development is because it is under conditions of capitalism that people are so alienated from their neighbors that they can be individually plugged in. Their desires can be individually plugged in directly to state power, allowing state power to channel those desires to direct bodies to oppress their neighbors, even neighbors of the same class. The concept of ideology provides cover for this. It makes it seem like the violence is the result of a kind of intellectual plague, when what is actually happening is that alienated people, who are entirely without any of the restraining influence that a healthy, connected society has, are having their desires manipulated by capital to help capitalists oppress workers. In fact, let's take it a step deeper. Book switch. In her book, Volatile Bodies, the feminist philosopher Elizabeth Gross talks about how the very notion of a disembodied intellect that is responsible for making decisions, for action, for behavior, and so on, is actually the direct consequence of a historical division of labor in which women are relegated to bodily tasks and men are given free rein to have the life of the mind, as it were. This social division between genders resulted in the notion of men occupying a space of pure conceptual freedom where women were relegated to the life of the body. The upshot is that a world of conceptual freedom of ideas came into the imagination as something separated from the body, so that even when society started to abandon the notion that men and women were so intellectually different that they couldn't occupy the same space, the idea of the human being defined by this one space separated from the other one, of the mind as being separated from the body, still maintained. And as a result, we ended up with a notion of the human being, of human decisions and libido, that effectively treated the human being as a kind of dead virtual space sitting atop an animal body that must be resisted and controlled at all costs. Of course, we know that our minds are also emergent from our bodies, indeed are fed constantly by our bodies, indeed we think through our bodies. We remember with our muscles, and our muscles remember. The blood that flows through our toes flows through our brain. Have a bad breakfast, think bad thoughts, and so on. Book switch back. Ideology, this notion of the mind as being possessed by a set of ideals, as if that was enough to motivate behavior, is exactly the distraction from the real problem, our lack of connection to each other, our alienation from each other, that allows fascism to creep back in under cover of darkness or in the broad light of day, as you increasingly see, for example, leftists embrace essentially fascist ideas that they justify by arguing that, well, we need to fight fire with fire and use the force of the state to erode our freedom to beat these bad guys before they do it to us first. Meanwhile, the underlying situation that makes us vulnerable to fascism hasn't changed. We've just changed the color of the flags. I think Technology Connections is completely right. We need to start caring about each other. And so the refrain of this channel, like a broken record going forward, is always going to be, if you do one thing this week, go outside and make a friend. Join a hobby group. Help somebody do a grocery order. Watch someone's dog. Go to a movie with somebody. Join a book club. Anything. Make it so that what happens to you impacts what happens to somebody else and vice versa. Because that is where your strength lies. Because if you don't have that, you literally have nothing. That is what it is to be a human being, as opposed to simply a subject of capital. I hope this was interesting. As always, thank you for listening, and take care.